Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another lesson. Today, we're going to be digging into the first two acts of Shakespeare's Othello, but we're not just going to summarize the events. We're really going to dig in and examine how the play constructs and critiques these different ideas about race, identity, and belonging. So, our key focus is how Shakespeare uses character relationships and societal tensions to explore the experience of being othered. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's start thinking about stereotypes. So, as defined here by the Collins English Dictionary, a stereotype is a set of inaccurate, simplistic generalizations about a group that allows others to categorize them or treat them accordingly. Now, since stereotypes reduce the complexity of our human identity into a short, usually negative summary, these generalizations aren't just false, they're usually very harmful. And they often reflect a dominant group's desire to define another group as inferior, dangerous, or amusing, as we see with Othello. And stereotype doesn't just happen in comedy sketches, it really shapes the way societies treat people in courtrooms, classrooms, and relationships. Take a moment and think about when you picture a typical British person, what comes to mind? Is it based on a lived experience or on film, TV, or cultural cliches? So take some time to kind of think about that a little bit. Circling back to Othello, we see how stereotypes work in social traps for characters such as Othello or Desdemona. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so this is your core question for the lecture. How do we interpret stereotypes in Othello? Now, the word Moor was commonly used in early modern England to describe Muslim or African people, but it was often imprecise because it was a shorthand for quote unquote non European or not like us. Now, in this play, Othello is constantly judged not only for his character or leadership, but for his racial and religious identity. All right. Now, Shakespeare didn't necessarily write Othello in a vacuum, obviously. He wrote it for a mostly white, mostly Christian audience in England. So, this is a country that was beginning to assert itself as an imperial power. Now, in this world, people who look like Othello were often seen as outsiders, threats, or curiosities. Now, in Acts 1 and 2, we kind of start to see the beginning of this racialized narrative being built around Othello. So, in Acts 1 and 2, we have Brabantio, which is Desdemona's father, if you recall, who can't believe that his daughter would fall in love with a black man without being quote unquote tricked. So he accuses Othello of witchcraft. Next, we have Iago, who is our main villain, who usually will often dehumanize Othello, constantly calling him quote unquote the thick lips and using animalistic metaphors to describe his relationship with Desdemona. Even allies, like the Duke, are surprised by Othello's intelligence and eloquence, as if these traits were unexpected from someone like him. And despite all that, Othello at this point still carries dignity and self-assurance. So he defends his love for Desdemona with powerful rhetoric and honesty. So again, Shakespeare is kind of presenting the stereotype, but at the same time also allowing us to, inviting us to question it. All right, next we have historical context. Okay, to fully understand the tensions in the play, we really have to step into the world of Elizabethan England, which is very different from our 2025 world. So many students are usually really surprised to learn that people of color were not entirely absent from Shakespeare's society. There were often African musicians, servants, merchants that were living in London at the time, and Queen Elizabeth herself even commented on the presence of Black Moors in her kingdom. But here's the catch. So even though they were present, they weren't fully accepted into society. So some were admired, some were distrusted. They occupied a strange kind of in-between social space where they were visible but at the same time marginalized. Now, it is really important to note that Shakespeare borrowed this story, so it's not his original idea. He adapted it from a 1565 novella by Cintio, in which the Moor marries a white woman and eventually kills her out of jealousy. Sorry, spoiler alert. So that story was a straightforward moral tale. Now, Shakespeare decided to kind of layer this with a deeper psychological view, and by asking important social questions. So especially around the intersections of race, love, and power. So that's something that he kind of did a little bit different in Othello. All right, let's go ahead and zoom in to this idea of quote unquote othering. So to other someone is to be labeled, is to label them essentially as fundamentally different, not like us, and therefore unworthy of equal treatment. So in colonial and early modern England, this happened constantly as English encountered new cultures. Now in Othello, we see both fetishization and villainization of the other. So let's go ahead and break down Desdemona's character, who is fetishized. Now, Desdemona is fascinated by Othello's exotic identity. She falls in love with his stories of adventure and survival, these tales that emphasize his difference, not his sameness. Now, the handkerchief passed from Othello to Desdemona becomes more than a token of love. It kind of becomes a symbol of Othello's cultural mystique. It's embroidered with this magic, and represents the lure of the familiar. Now, his scars could maybe mean literal marks of his experience, so they become romanticized almost as trophies of his foreignness. But the same qualities that attract Desdemona lead others to fear and condemn Othello. So it's pretty interesting how there's this almost duality between these things. Now, let's talk about the villainization that follows Othello. Now, his background, originally from Africa or the Middle East, formerly Muslim and formerly enslaved, is used by Iago to paint him as dangerous and volatile. So he is repeatedly associated with the devil, magic, barbarianism, terms that often used to justify colonial violence. Now, this duality, essentially the exotic object of desire, the threatening outsider, is really central to understanding how othering works in the play. Othello is never allowed to just be. He is constantly being defined by others. Oh. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Othello's alienation. Now, scholar Edward Berry argues that Othello might be more radical than it appears, so he claims that while the play includes racist characters, the play itself does not endorse their views. Berry points out that Shakespeare's Othello is less racially aggressive than its source material. Othello is portrayed as noble, introspective, and articulate, not a stereotype, but a complex, tragic hero. And so while the play contains racism, it doesn't reward it. So that's really important to note. So in fact, the most racist character, Iago, is ultimately exposed and punished. Now, this perspective really encourages us to see Othello not as a victim of racism, but as a character with dignity, depth, and tragic flaws, just like Hamlet, Macbeth, or King Lear. Now, why is this important? Why should this matter to us now? So first, the understanding of historical context really helps us read Shakespeare more accurately, and we avoid the mistake of projecting our values backward, and we also avoid excusing past injustices as quote-unquote normal for the time. Second, these themes are still with us. So think about how stereotypes shape stories in modern media. Who gets cast as the villain? Who gets to be the romantic lead? Who is exoticized, feared, or ignored? Now, by studying a play like Othello, we can kind of train ourselves to see how identity is constructed and how literature can either reinforce or resist these dominant narratives. And finally, recognizing these forces help us kind of become more thoughtful creators, consumers, and critics of the stories that help shape our world, because media is everywhere and we consume it every day. So it's really important for us to be able to recognize these. Okay, now let's close first with some reflection. And as you review Acts 1 and 2, consider how Desdemona's family and community respond to her marriage. Think about what those reactions reveal, not just about them, but the world that they live in. And complete the review questions for Acts 1 and 2. Be sure to respond to stereotypes in Othello discussion prompts on Canvas. Once you finish these tasks, they'll hopefully help sharpen your analysis and contribute to the ongoing conversation about power, race, and identity in literature. Thanks so much for listening, and I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.